I hadn't heard about that. It's an interesting thought. I actually think that early voting is more complicated than just allowing people to vote early because there are significant problems in our registration system. We found out that when a person goes to register the DMV actually does a record check because they have the systems and facilities there to make sure that the person's social security number matches up with a social security number and do some backups. But when a person registers with the registrar, either in person or say through a voter drive, no one ever checks to see if Mr. X is actually Mr. X. The only check is that person has signed a form saying he promises that he's Mr. X. So some of us are worried that if you expanded early voting, you're setting up a system where someone could go create false identifications and then vote early and then go to their home state. Second thing is that right now in the United States, there's no way to find out when someone moves whether or not they've moved. If you move from Fairfax to Alexandria, the State Board of Elections knows to take you off the Fairfax list and keep you in Alexandria. But my brother moved from my parents' house 18 years ago from New York, and he is still on the voter list. And I always just keep it there to watch, to see when these lists get cleaned up, because I'll find out when his name's gone.
Didn't he vote in your last election?
Yeah. My brother is a big Democrat, so we asked him to stay in New York. So, I think if we do an early voting thing, it's got to be a package deal where some of the reforms we're looking at to make sure that the voting lists are more secure and more accurate are combined with expanded opportunity to vote.
Bruce, I'm going to take a shot at this also because I know everyone is rightly unhappy with the lines that we had on this last election day, which is now 2 cycles in a row. And I stood, I had no choice. I was shaking hands, and you're talking to people for 45 minutes because they're not going anywhere. So I get it. I think there's a couple things that I would suggest. One is I'm going to put a bill in to have more voting machines per registered voters in the precinct because I think we need to have one. Listen, thanks. I mean, it's kind of obvious, so I'm happy to get the applause. Excuse me? And more poll books. But I think another issue is having the constitutional amendments at the same time that we're voting on the federal offices. We get more voters in a federal year, so yes, you get more federal participation, but by the same token, that absolutely makes the process longer. So it may be trying to get a different sequence might speed the process up. Let me say one thing about early voting, and you know what, when I run a campaign, I like to have sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I try and sequence my message to the voters. And to be honest, if people are voting 30 days out, maybe if they're voting for me, I don't care, but by the same token, I want to have a campaign where people actually listen to the candidates before they just run out and cast a vote. So I'm a little bit reticent about people being able to vote before there's even a campaign. And so that is one reservation I have about early voting. I'll just put it out there right now.
Senator Evan.
Regarding early voting, when I put in a bill to allow what I would call no excuse absentee voting about 3 years ago, I did some research and I found out that Virginia was the only state in the country that had its polls closed at 7 p.m. and didn't allow early voting. So to me, we want to make it easier to vote, not harder to vote. And we've seen a problem in the Privileges and Elections subcommittees that deal with this, or I should say in the House, no offense to nearly every member on this stage, because they're not all the problem or consistently against this. I would say regarding fraud that there's no evidence of any significant fraud in the United States with voting. And if you wanted to commit fraud in Virginia to influence the outcome of an election, you couldn't just vote twice. You'd have to have hundreds of people voting twice. And even then, it probably wouldn't be enough because that would be considered a very close election. We do have are participating in a new program to match moves with other states. I don't quite understand how it works, but I went to the Electoral Boards Association meeting this summer in Northern Virginia, and they say they're working on that. I'm concerned even about that. I hate for there to be one Bill Smith in Virginia and another Bill Smith in Florida and have one of them disqualified because of some extenuating circumstance. I don't think that's a big problem, although I would like to see our voter rolls cleaned up. If the governor's for this, I'm glad it'll be a big step forward.
Let me just tell you something. There wasn't a single state that wasn't controlled by, that was controlled by the Democrats that this type of legislation was put in. It was obvious why. Let me tell you, Ray Charles could see through this. All right, it was put in. It was put in for one reason, and it didn't work. And I'll tell you why it didn't work. In every single state that it was put in, there were two states that Obama didn't carry that he carried before. Well, he carried Indiana. He didn't this time. Lost it by a substantial amount. Lost Missouri by a substantial amount. The only state that it might possibly have affected the outcome was North Carolina. I mean, these laws were put in virtually. It was put in Pennsylvania. It was put in Virginia. It was put in Florida. It was not put in Colorado. It was not put in New Mexico.
The swing states.
It was put in most of the swing states, and it didn't affect the outcome anywhere where we knew what the results were going to be 2 to 3 weeks out. There isn't any damn voter fraud, and everybody sitting in this room knows it. When the bill passed in Pennsylvania, the Senate Majority Leader was quoted, and it was used in the trial. He said, "With this, we will carry the state for Romney." When it passed, those were his exact words. "We've just elected Romney from Pennsylvania." As you know, he lost Pennsylvania by 300,000 votes. But I mean, this is why it was put in. It wasn't put in for any other reason. And all this stuff about voter fraud was a load of crap. And I don't have any problem with early voting, or the more people that you can get to the polls, the better off you are in either party, okay?
I have been a strong supporter of being able to allow local governments to change the starting date. I know some of the opposition evolves around, oh my goodness, we need these young people to work in tourist-type activities, and we can't afford to have them not take these jobs. But the fact of the matter is I think the local school boards actually do know and understand the dynamic of their communities, and would wisely select a calendar time that would work. The irony is something like 75% of the school systems in the state have an exception to the rule. So there's plenty of evidence now to look at, how are the school systems doing? Are the kids, is there some bad economic impact? Are the kids suffering? What has happened since local governments have gained the authority or have been granted the exception? So I am a strong supporter of that, but it has run into trouble in the General Assembly. And your second question was on transportation.
Okay. Why don't we let Dick
Okay.
can answer that question too?
Which one?
This King's Dominion.
Yeah, since I was the author of the bill back in 1986, that's an interesting situation. I have some friends that are in favor of opening after Labor Day, and some friends who are opposed, who want to open before Labor Day. I've always supported my friends, and I've voted on both sides of that issue. One of the things that I want to try to find out is, because we're only talking essentially, with the exception of far southwest Virginia, we're talking 4 days. Prior to the so-called King's Dominion bill, and they opened the Tuesday before the Labor Day weekend. The general pattern when that happened was the kids showed up on Tuesday. They were there on Wednesday. They weren't there on Thursday and Friday because they took that one that was a huge absentee period. So I didn't see what the damage was or what the problem was by moving it 1 week later. And trust me, I suspect that I'm going to find out looking at the data. It's most of the school districts that are east of or west of 95 that have the exemption. That's right. Most of the ones to the east do not. What I'm going to do is try to find out, and I can get that information, as to has there been more improvement with the standards of learning test west of 95 than east of 95. And quite frankly, if it hasn't, then I don't see why we would bother to even change it back. And quite frankly, we might want to start revoking some of those exceptions that we've given these other people. Let me tell you what would change my mind totally if we went to 200 days a year instead of 180.
Great.
And I will tell you why. We are one of the few countries still stuck at 180 days. The rest of the world goes longer. We've got a situation in Petersburg, and I talked about this with the Alexandria City Council last night. We got a situation in Petersburg that is nothing short of dreadful. I mean, it is the worst performing system in the state. High minority, tremendous amount of poverty. It's unbelievable. And we've tried all kinds of things down there, okay? What would be interesting, because it wouldn't cost us, it would cost the state $4 million to pick up the cost of this, is to take them to 200 days and see at the end of 5 years if we've seen a marked improvement. When I've talked to elementary school teachers who've taught in poor areas, and I had a relative that had a career in the DC public schools, she often told me that it took till almost November to get them back to where they were in June because of the time that they were out in the summer. And if we could get significant results from that, the cost of doing this statewide, for the state to pay for it, is a little over $800 million. I talked to the governor about that, or quite frankly, almost what we refund every year in the car tax, which is one of the dumbest things we ever did, okay? But, and let me tell you something. The guy that did that, Jim Gilmore, ran against the guy who he said gave the biggest tax increase in history. Wasn't true, but he did increase taxes. That was Mark Warner. The guy that raised the taxes beat the guy who did give the biggest tax cut in history by 2 to 1. Okay? So much for that guarantee you in success at the polls. So, I mean, that would be one way to pay for that, but I'd like to see what kind of results we're getting, and quite frankly, there's a pretty decent potential lab sitting down there in Petersburg that we could experiment with. As far as you said you couldn't get over here, you can take the hot lanes from where you live and get off at Gallows Road. If you don't get off at Gallows, you got to go down to Braddock, because you can't get off at Little River. But you can get off at Gallows, and then you only got one exit, and just stay on the inside, shoulder, and you'll be fine, okay? Do it all the time.
This is an issue that's been around for years and years and years, and we have a majority of people who've pledged never to raise a tax, that they signed a pledge that they're not going to raise taxes. Now, if you read your papers lately, there's people that are backing off their pledge at the federal level, and that's a good sign. But we do have that problem, and most of Virginia does not have a transportation problem, and we don't have the votes yet. But even if we do, a lot of our delegation from Northern Virginia is the same way, that they will not. They've signed the pledge from up here. Now, if your implication that we should use general fund money as part of a compromise, we don't have extra money laying around. We're underfunding higher education. We've signed an agreement to close down our 5 training centers and move intellectually disabled people into the community. We don't know how we're going to fund that. We have an obligation to do 480 more slots per year on that. And so if we have public safety, we have 35 to 37,000 people in prison here. We can't look at prison reform. Last year, I put in a bill to study implementing parole again for nonviolent prisoners only. And the other side put out a press release saying I wanted to institute parole again. So, I mean, it's just, these are very expensive things that we do, and we don't have enough money for them. So if you wanted to take a little bit of general fund money, like we did in 3202, which is we're using now, that part was not struck down, it wouldn't make that much difference. So as far as I'm concerned, it would be, there's no money really to go to take from general fund monies, if that's what you mean by compromise.
I'll tell you what would be a compromise. I'd be willing, and I swore once I'd never do this, but I would now, raise the sales tax 1%. One half of that going to transportation, which is about $500 million, $600 million a year, which will take care of the maintenance problem for quite a while. And the other 0.5% would go to education, with half of it being split for K through 12 and half of it through higher education.
That sounds just like...
That's what I would be willing to do that now. And I don't have any problem with us matching Maryland or the district. Hell, Tennessee's at 9.5% sales tax. North Carolina, they're all higher than us. North Carolina is 7.25% to 8.5%, depending on where you live. I don't have any problem doing that, and I'd be willing to split it with transportation, and it would provide a fair amount of money. But it's not going to pass unless you had a governor that had the ability to close deals. And we haven't had that kind of governor since Warner. And before Warner, we didn't have that governor since Belials. And before him, we didn't have it since Mills Godwin. Okay, so they don't come along very often.
I just want to add one thought to this. You know, there are studies out that really demonstrate the more you let your transportation infrastructure deteriorate, the bigger the impact has on economic development and the vitality of the state. You know, Virginia used to be ranked #1 as the best state in the country to do business, and now we're ranked 3. We moved down very quickly. And in large part, it was because our investment in transportation is just not there. So we're trying to, I mean, when you have this argument with policymakers, it has a lot to do with what vision do you have for the state? I mean, where do you want to see the state go? Do you want to see, you know, growth in a sensible way? By 2017, we will have no state dollars for road construction, 0. And right now, Virginia doesn't have money to even match federal dollars coming in. So we can't even leverage money. It's really pretty embarrassing when you look at the situation. But I can tell you, friends, the only way we're going to do it is if people can come together and agree to support an increase in revenue, whether it's an increase in the gasoline tax or the sales tax. We are going to have to tax ourselves to get this money coming in. And that's just the way it is. And we have to pay a lot more attention to politicians and their platitudes on how they're going to fix transportation.
If I could. Can I just say something really quick about the House? We had a moment last year in the House which I thought sort of foreshadowed what's to come in Virginia. There was a bill that I put in for 3 years in a row. The first year, they wouldn't give me a hearing. The second year, they kicked it to the Reform Commission. The third year, 3 Republicans stole it from me, which is a good sign. And so then I worked with them to get this bill through. What it did was it reallocated the seats in the Commonwealth Transportation Board, because right now, the Commonwealth Transportation Board representation is based on the congressional districts from 1930. And so 30% of the state has 60-some% of the votes, and 60% of the state has 30% of the votes. And so I worked with Tom Rust, Chris Peace, who's a Republican from Hanover, Jim LeMunyon from Western Fairfax, Manoli Lupasi from Richmond. And we ended up lining up 54 votes to get that out of the House, to get that bill out of the House, because Hampton Roads, Richmond, Northern Virginia came together to get that bill out. And there were 3 delegates from Richmond who protested and wouldn't vote for it. So there's about 57, 58 votes in that urban crescent that's on the receiving end of this transportation problem right now. And So in terms of, the margin of error in the House, in terms of how many votes we can afford to lose to get something like that out, it's probably about 8 votes. And I'm not sure that the votes are there yet in the House. These guys would know better than me, but I tell you that the howls of pain that we heard from the rest of the state in the debate were incredible. These people on the transportation board, they don't represent people, they represent roads, and we have to look at how many lane miles are traveled, not how many people live in places, and a lot of interesting arguments from the rest of the state. And what this really is, aside from being the partisan tax policy issue, there's a real regional divide. And another thing that's bouncing around in this whole debate is whether or not we do something that addresses the maintenance shortfall or whether we go beyond that to construction. And if you leave it to where we only fund maintenance, we'll get a lot of the rural votes. But as soon as we start paying for construction, that is Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, and Richmond, that's when people start bailing out like crazy. And there's a compromise in there somewhere, Fran. And I think a lot of folks in Northern Virginia don't want to do anything unless construction's included. I think if all we did was fix maintenance, we could probably solve the problem pretty quickly, or solve that problem quickly. But the construction part, as soon as we get into that, these regional guys the regional battles start really kicking in hard, and that's when people peel off like crazy. But at least that's what I see. But I think the writing is on the wall in the House in terms of we're starting to cooperate together regionally a little bit. And hopefully we'll get that bill through next year. It died in a Senate committee last year, and Chap mentioned he was going to put it in again this year.
I'm looking at transportation funding. There's a couple of key elements that I'm looking at that I think most of the people at this table could probably agree on, and it's a matter of getting the rest of the state to agree on. And the first one is making sure that we're capturing out-of-state revenue. We've got a lot of people that come through Virginia, a huge number of them that come down I-95 and I-81, and so I think we want to make sure that whatever we put in place, that it's capturing those travelers who also put wear and tear on our roads. The second one is that it needs to be a long-term fix. And I don't want to get stuck 5 years from now, 10 years from now, trying to make these decisions all over again. I think we saw the folly of 17.5 cents on the gallon and then not being able to touch that since 1986. And then last but not least, this is a regional issue. And so it needs to at least be fair to Northern Virginia, what we come up with. We can't wind up at the losing end of that. And I know Dick doesn't have a rosy picture of this necessarily getting out of the Senate, but I mentioned earlier that Senator John Watkins has come up with a plan that I actually think hits on a couple of those, and I'd be interested in your perspective on that. And what it is it basically applies a 5% sales tax to gasoline at the retail level.
No, it doesn't.
No,
Not at the wholesale level. And so, number one, it's a lot of money, but because it's a percentage, it grows with the cost of gasoline. So it's long-term, it's sustainable, it captures a lot of that out-of-state traffic. When you look at where gas is purchased in Virginia, actually Northern Virginia makes out very well. It matches better with our population than any other kind of revenue source. And so it's actually the fairest way of going about doing that. The regressive nature of it is addressed by the fact that there will also be an offset in the income tax for lower brackets. And for those who really are stretched tight by having an increase in the gas tax, you can offset that by reducing the amount of income tax. So I think it's a very well-balanced thing. The part as a Prius owner that gives me a little pause, although I understand what he's trying to do, is I drive my Prius just as much at 40 miles per gallon than I would if I had a 20 mile per gallon car. But I'm not paying any of the gas tax on that. And so one of the things that Senator Watkins has put in there is if you own a Prius, you own an electric hybrid or electric vehicle, that the amount that you didn't pay in taxes that year, you'd have an annual assessment that you'd have to go ahead and put into for infrastructure maintenance. So again, while it kind of pains me to say it, it's probably a fair way to go ahead and do it. But I'd be interested in your feedback, not necessarily now, but whether that's a good starting point for moving forward in Virginia on transportation.
If I can just jump in for a little bit, and first of all, let me thank all of you for being here, and in particular my constituent Marlene. There might be some other constituents out there. Thanks for being here tonight. I also want to thank JCRC for hosting another event like this, and I do apologize for being a little bit late, but I actually represent Tyson's Corner. I know Ed mentioned it earlier, and the nice thing about having Tyson's Corner is that we have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of commercial buildings and such. Bad thing about having Tyson's Corner in your district is, of course, it's the transportation problem nightmare of Northern Virginia, and also it has a lot of hotels, and so just about every event happens in my district. And there was an event that had Turkish Americans had tonight, and so I had to stop by there for a little bit before I got here. But just on the transportation point, and Fran, to your point about compromise, we've heard from a lot of substantive experts here, and I'm sure we can talk about substance all night long, but just let's get to the point of politics. What I've been told by a lot of conversations over the last 2-3 weeks, Republicans and Democrats, lobbyists as well as members, is that the Watkins plan is definitely a good idea as far as getting the conversation going. And my understanding is the governor has already said, and he's told me and he's told a lot of other people, that he wants to make sure everybody stays in the session until we get something done on transportation. Now, of course, as a governor who's leaving in his last year in office, he can say a lot of those types of things because he wants to make sure he has a good legacy. And to his credit, he should have a good legacy on transportation because that is something that he ran on. But the problem is, what I understand from my House colleagues and the House leadership on the other side of the aisle, is that the Speaker would rather see this become a campaign issue for the two candidates next year rather than the General Assembly dealing with it now, because this is a kind of issue, the transportation comprehensive solution is a kind of issue that you really need buy-in from all around the Commonwealth. You need everybody to pay attention, and you need a mandate from the governor whichever way it goes. And so as of today, it appears it's going to be Terry McAuliffe versus Ken Cuccinelli, but the House members would rather see this campaign about transportation and the solutions and who has a better idea, and have them go out there and campaign for a whole year so that all of us as voters can choose that. Now, I personally don't like that idea at all, because that just, all that means is we're kicking down the can 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road, and we're seeing the same thing happening in Washington, D.C. with the fiscal cliff, where they don't want to solve big problems, they don't want to accuse anybody of being in whoever's pockets, so they kick the can down. I think all of us have to step up and say, whether this costs us our election or not, we need to get something done. And so if we don't get it done in 2013, I don't see when we're going to get people together. So my message to all of you is, regardless of the rest of us up here who are willing to support a compromise, the reality is it can't be done if we don't have House Republican leadership at the table saying this has to be done this year. Because even if we pass the Watkins bill out of the Senate this year, if it dies in the House, shame on all of us. That's going to be gone for another 2 years, 3 or 4 years. So
it ain't going to go out of the Senate unless it passes the House first.
yeah, well, so that just proves the point that we have a bottleneck, and it's not something that, unfortunately, a lot of us on the Democratic side can really influence, because we only have 32 votes out of 100. So if y'all could make the message really clear that don't kick down the can down the road, let's solve transportation this year while we're still in office. Thanks.